So now we're discussing topics in chapter 2 of the book. We're going to talk about things like variables and primitive data types, but a lot of this is just the building blocks of programming. Every programming language is going to have some type of primitive data, and it's important to understand how to use them and what types there are. In Java, we have 8. We have 4 for integers, and we have 2 for floating points. A floating point is a number with a decimal point and some fractional part. And we also have a Boolean, which represents 2 states, true or false. And char, that represents character data. In Java, we use the Unicode character set, and the first 128 characters of the Unicode character set is the ASCII character set. I know it seems like a lot of information to digest right now, but this is the basic building blocks of Java. Our next topic is primitive data. We're going to focus on primitive data, the declaration uses of variables, expressions and operator precedence, and data conversions. A variable is a name for a location in memory that holds a value. A variable declaration specifies the variable's name and type of information that it will hold. So you can see here, they're declaring a variable. This is the data type, and this is the name of the variable. The name of the variable must be a valid Java identifier. A valid Java identifier can be composed of numbers, letters, the $sign, and the underscore, but it can't start with a number. Multiple variables can be declared in one line. Here they have the data type, the name of the variable, another name for a variable, and another name for a variable. All these variables are of the int data type. A variable can be given an initial value in the declaration. So here they're assigning a value to sum, they're assigning it to 0. Here they're assigning 32 to base, and they're assigning max 149. When a variable is referenced in a program, its current value is used. So here is the example in the book. They declare a variable called keys and they assign it 88, and then they print out that value, and there's the output. An assignment statement changes the value of a variable. The assignment operator is the equal sign. Total is assigned the value 55. The value that was in total is overwritten. So if total had like your previous value before it got to this line, it's going to be overwritten and it's now going to hold 55. You can only assign a value to a variable that is consistent with the variable's declared type. So what that means is if total is declared to hold an integer, you can't assign it a string. The next example is a class called geometry. You can see they set sides to 7 and they print out the sides. Then they set sides to 10 and they print out that value. Then 12 and they print out that value. And this is what the output looks like. A heptagon has 7 sides, a decagon has 10 sides, and a dodecagon has 12 sides. The course coding standard has rules for variables. Variable names should be named something that describes what the variable represents and should begin with a lowercase letter and be camel case when composed of 2 or more words. So if you go into Canvas and read our coding standard, you will see that there is an explanation on how to create variables. So here are some examples of valid variable names that comply with their coding standard. Name, first name, you can see the second word in this variable is capitalized. My first name, and you can see whenever you start a new word, that letter is capitalized. But it always starts with a lowercase letter. A constant is an identifier that is similar to a variable except that it holds the same value during its entire existence. As the name implies, a constant is not a variable. The compiler will issue an error if you try to change the value of a constant. In Java, we use the final modifier to declare a constant. For a constant, once you assign a value and you try to change that value later on in the program, Java will give you an error. So here's an example. We use the final modifier, we still specify the data type, and then we give it an identifier. Now we do have a coding standard for constants, so constants should be in all caps, and whenever you have 2 words, you're going to use a underscore to indicate there's 2 words. Constants are useful for 3 important reasons. First, they give meaning to otherwise unclear literal values. Second, they facilitate program maintenance. If a constant is used in multiple places, its value need only to be set in one place. Third, they formally establish that a value should not be changed, avoiding inadvertent errors by other programmers. The course coding standard has rules for constants. Constants should be in all caps and use the underscore to separate 2 or more words. Use constants instead of using literal values in equations. There should be no magic numbers. Magic numbers are literal numbers in your code that have no meaning directly associated with it. Give meaning to numbers by creating a constant variable for them. So here are some examples of constants. You have max, max num, max temp value, human years factor. When I say use constants in equations, what I'm wanting is for you not to use literal values inside of your equations. Make a constant and give that literal value some meaning. It's also important to understand what should not be constant. Variables that should not be a constant, which means they should not have a final modifier or not have an identifier in all caps, include but are not limited to variables used to store input from the user, variables used to store the result of a calculation. Use descriptive names. Similar to variables, constants should be named something that specifies the context of the value it holds. For instance, avoid using names like 2, 0.1, or factor. Use names like num of test, val of dime, seconds, and minute. Alright, I created a program so I can demonstrate some of the things that we just talked about. So I named this program variables and constants. The name of my class matches the name of my file. And I also have the main method. Inside the main method is where I'm going to put my programming statements. Now, one of the things that I encourage all students to do that I have not been doing is once you've written your class header and your main method header, it's always important to compile just to verify that you haven't made any mistakes when you first start off. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm able to compile. You can run, but there's no output because you don't actually have any programming statements inside the main method. But it's always a good idea to start off by compiling your program once you've created your class header and your method header. For variables, the first thing we have to do is specify the type of data that it's going to hold. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make a string. So we've talked about string literals. So I'm just going to make a string with a capital S. I'm going to call this one name. And name is going to equal my name. This is a variable declaration with highlighted. This is telling Java, create a variable, and this variable is going to store a string. And then I use what we call the assignment operator to store this value, Michael, inside of this variable. So I'm doing two steps in one statement. This can also be done by first declaring your variable, and then on the next line, assigning that variable a value. Okay, so it does the same thing as what I had before, but I'm using two lines. I prefer doing it the other way if I know immediately like what value this variable is going to hold. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now what I'm going to do is just output my name. Okay, so I've written this program where I create a variable, and then I just take that variable and I output it to the console. Let me go ahead and compile and run this program. And you can see that I outputted that variable. You can also make a variable to hold one of the 8 primitive data types, and we'll talk about the 8 primitive data types here in a little bit. But one of the primitive data types is an integer. And we use int to indicate an integer. And I'm going to go ahead and make a variable called my fav num, and that's going to be equal to 5. Now I'm going to make an output statement that's going to output my favorite number. So I made this output statement where I'm outputting this value of the variable. Now when I compile and I run, you can see that I'm getting that output of 5. So whenever you create a variable, you can always change the value later. So from the lecture side, they gave you the example of creating a variable and then perhaps coming down here and just setting your favorite number to something else. This time I'll say 7. And I'm going to go ahead and output that value. And now when I compile and I run, you can see that my fav num had 5, but now it stores 7. So this is a variable. I assign it a value, and then I change that value and I output this value. Now it's different with constants. If you were to declare something as a constant, then we can only set the value one time and it cannot be changed after that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a constant. The constant that I'm going to create is going to represent the max number of students in my class. To do that, I'm going to use what we call the final modifier. This tells Java that the value is in fact a constant and it's not going to change. Then you're going to specify the data type. I'm going to use an int. And because this is a constant, I'm going to follow our coding standard and make the value in all caps. So max students, and I'm going to set this to 20. Now I'm going to go ahead and output this value. So I went ahead and made this statement. The max number of students in my course is, and then I print out the value. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and run, and you can see there's that constant value. Now the thing about constants is once you set the value, it cannot be changed. If I come down here and I try to change the value and print it out again, Java's going to get upset with me and I'm going to get an error. So I changed the max number of students to 6, and let's see what happens when I try to compile. Immediately Java noticed that I tried to change the value of a constant and it gave me the error, cannot assign a value to final variable, and it's telling me which statement was the error created on, and it's telling me actually the line number, line 22. I go to line 22 and you can see this is where that statement's at. So we are not allowed to modify this value. So I'm going to go ahead and just comment this out.